In the autumn mist of 1890, when the cypress trees of Georgia's Blackwater Slough stood like cathedral spires against a gray sky, the children of Bitter End committed an act so unspeakable that the county records still whisper of it in hushed, bureaucratic terms. On Sunday, October 26th, as the congregation of the True Vine Baptist Church raised their voices in evening hymnal, two orphaned siblings barricaded the doors from the outside and set the building ablaze with everyone inside. The official report speaks of tragedy, of a fallen lantern and timber dry as kindling. But the deathbed confessions of those who lived nearby tell a different story, one of deliberate vengeance enacted by children who had discovered something far more horrifying than fire awaiting them in that isolated settlement. What investigators found in the days following the inferno challenged everything they thought they understood about divine mercy and human depravity. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, please subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. The flames consumed 23 souls that night, including preacher Josiah Crow, the man who had built his congregation on a foundation of scripture and suffering. When the ashes finally cooled, searchers discovered evidence of something that made the fire seem like an act of divine intervention rather than human malice. This was not just a crime of passion committed by desperate children. This was the final judgment rendered upon a family whose bloodline had grown so twisted that their very existence had become an abomination against nature itself. Bitter End exists on no modern map, swallowed decades ago by the encroaching waters and vegetation of Blackwater Slough. To reach this forgotten settlement, one had to navigate a treacherous maze of cypress knees and Spanish moss, following wooden planks laid across standing water that reflected the sky like black mirrors. The journey required a guide familiar with the shifting channels, someone who knew which shadows concealed solid ground and which promised only the sucking embrace of bottomless mud. The settlement itself occupied a rare patch of elevated ground, perhaps 3 acres in total, connected to the outside world by a single narrow causeway that flooded with every heavy rain. At its heart stood the True Vine Baptist Church, a crude wooden structure whose bell tower served as both beacon and watchtower for the 15 families that called this place home. The church dominated everything, its shadow falling across the communal well, the small graveyard with its tilting markers, and the cluster of one-room cabins that housed the faithful. But the most significant feature of Bitter End was what it lacked: a way out that did not require the permission and guidance of those in power. The swamp formed natural walls more effective than any prison, channels that shifted with the seasons and storms, paths that led nowhere but deeper into the maze of stagnant water and hanging moss. During the winter months, when the waters rose, the settlement became an island complete in its isolation, cut off from the laws and oversight of the outside world. In such a place, the word of one man became absolute law, his interpretation of Scripture the only truth that mattered. Here, in this forgotten corner of creation, preacher Josiah Crow had built something that resembled a congregation but functioned more like a kingdom, with himself as its undisputed sovereign and the swamp as his castle walls. Preacher Josiah Crow stood 6 feet tall in his prime, a man whose voice could shake the rafters when he called upon the Lord's judgment and whose pale blue eyes seemed to pierce straight through to a person's soul. By 1890, age and something else had begun their work upon him. His hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. His left eyelid drooped with palsy, and his once powerful frame had grown gaunt beneath his black preaching coat. Yet when he stepped behind his pulpit, the years seemed to fall away, and the commanding presence that had dominated Bitter End for 3 decades emerged once more. The Crow family had ruled this settlement since its founding in 1860, establishing their authority through a combination of religious fervor and careful isolation from outside influence. Josiah's father, Ezra Crow, had led his followers into the swamp during the chaos following the war, promising them a place where they could practice their faith without interference from carpetbaggers or federal authorities. What he had built was something far stranger than a simple refuge. The Crow bloodline ran through every family in Bitter End, like poison through water. Sister Abigail Crow, Josiah's eldest daughter, and the settlement's schoolmistress, bore the pale complexion and weak chin that marked all of Ezra's descendants. Her persistent cough, which she tried to hide behind a yellowed handkerchief, grew worse each winter. Ezekiel Crow, Josiah's hulking son, possessed immense physical strength but spoke in the halting, simple words of a child. His left eye clouded with a milky blue blindness that some whispered was the mark of too much shared blood between his parents. The doctrine they preached spoke of purity, of keeping the faithful separate from a corrupt world, but visitors who looked closely at the congregation during services noticed disturbing similarities. The same weak jawlines, the same pale, almost translucent skin, the same trembling hands that seemed to run through every family like a signature written in flesh and bone. What seemed like devotion to divine law was actually something far more earthly and far more desperate, the last gasps of a bloodline that had been closing in on itself for generations. The first warning came in the spring of 1880, though few recognized it as such at the time. Thomas Whitmore, an orphaned boy of 14, had been indentured to the Crow family the previous autumn through the county's child placement program. According to the official records, he was a model ward, diligent in his duties and eager to learn the scriptures under Preacher Crow's guidance. Then, without explanation, he was gone. The story the Crows told was simple and believable. Thomas had grown restless as spring arrived, speaking often of running away to seek his fortune in Atlanta or Savannah. One morning in April, his bed was found empty, his few possessions still neatly arranged in the small room he shared with two other orphaned boys. Sister Abigail reported that she had caught him stealing food from the pantry the week before, behavior she interpreted as preparation for flight. The county sheriff, when he finally made his way through the swamp to investigate 3 weeks later, accepted this explanation without question. Runaway indentured children were common enough, especially boys approaching the age where they might strike out on their own. He filed a brief report noting Thomas as a fugitive servant and warned the surrounding counties to watch for a thin boy with dark hair and no family to claim him. But Old Man Hemlock, a trapper who lived alone on the eastern edge of the swamp, told a different story to anyone willing to listen. He claimed to have found the boy's body 3 days after the reported disappearance, floating face down in a channel deep in the maze of waterways that surrounded Bitter End. The corpse bore marks that suggested violence, Hemlock insisted, though when he led a reluctant deputy back to the spot weeks later, nothing remained but empty water and silence. The Crows buried an empty coffin in their small graveyard, marking it with a wooden cross and Thomas's name carved in letters that the weather quickly began to blur. They spoke of him during services as a wayward child who had chosen the wide path that leads to destruction. A cautionary tale about the dangers that awaited those who rejected the protection of the faithful. What they did not speak of was the way Thomas had begun asking questions in his final weeks. Questions about why all the families in Bitter End looked so similar and why the orphaned children never seemed to grow old enough to leave. The system that delivered children like Thomas into the hands of predators disguised as preachers was a product of the chaos following the war between the states. With so many fathers dead and families scattered, orphanages in cities like Atlanta and Savannah overflowed with children who had no one to claim them. The solution, crafted by well-meaning bureaucrats, was to place these children with rural families who could provide them with food, shelter, and moral guidance in exchange for labor. On paper, the arrangement seemed to benefit everyone involved. Farmers and tradesmen gained workers without the expense of wages. Children received homes and education, and the state reduced the burden on its overcrowded institutions. The contracts, officially called indentures, bound the children to their assigned families until they reached adulthood, typically 18 years for girls and 21 for boys. During this time, they were considered wards rather than servants, entitled to basic care and religious instruction. In practice, the system created opportunities for exploitation that authorities either could not or would not prevent. Rural families, especially those in isolated areas like Blackwater Slough, operated beyond the reach of regular inspection. The county official tasked with checking on indentured children might visit once or twice a year, if weather and circumstances permitted. Even then, such visits were often perfunctory, more concerned with paperwork than the actual welfare of the children involved. Preacher Josiah Crow understood these weaknesses better than most. His reputation as a godly man who took in unwanted children preceded him when he appeared at the county courthouse in the spring of 1885. He spoke eloquently of his calling to care for the orphaned and abandoned, quoting scripture with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life in its study. The officials who processed his request to take custody of two newly orphaned siblings saw exactly what he wanted them to see: a devoted servant of the Lord offering Christian charity to children who had nowhere else to go. The paperwork was completed in less than an hour. Alara Whitfield, 16, and her brother Silas, 14, became wards of the True Vine Baptist Church, their care entrusted to a man who viewed them not as children to be protected, but as resources to be consumed. Alara and Silas Whitfield arrived at Bitter End on a gray morning in late April of 1885, their few possessions wrapped in a single cloth bundle and their eyes wide with the uncertainty that comes with losing everything familiar. Their parents had died in a mill accident 3 months earlier, crushed beneath machinery that had been poorly maintained and operated beyond its safe limits. With no relatives willing or able to take them in, they had become wards of the state, their fate determined by strangers who saw them as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. The journey through Blackwater Slough had been their first taste of true isolation. The man who guided their wagon through the maze of channels and standing water spoke little, responding to their questions with grunts and gestures toward the seemingly impenetrable wall of cypress trees and Spanish moss that surrounded them. As they traveled deeper into the swamp, the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the constant drone of insects and the splash of unseen creatures moving through the dark water. Preacher Crow met them at the edge of the settlement, his tall frame draped in a black coat that made him appear even more imposing against the backdrop of the crude wooden buildings. He greeted them with words of welcome that somehow felt more like warnings, speaking of the blessed opportunity they had been given to live among the truly faithful and learn the ways of righteousness. His pale blue eyes lingered on Alara in a way that made her skin crawl, though she was too young and inexperienced to understand why. The other children of Bitter End watched their arrival with expressions that mixed curiosity with something darker, a knowledge born of experience that the newcomers had not yet gained. They were introduced to their new home, a single room in what Sister Abigail called the Lamb's Dormitory, a building that housed all the orphaned and indentured children in the settlement. The door, they noticed, could be barred from the outside, though the reason for this security measure would not become clear until much later. That first night, as they lay on their narrow beds, listening to the sounds of the swamp beyond the thin wooden walls, Alara whispered to her brother that something felt wrong about this place. The other children were too quiet, too careful in their movements, as if they were afraid of being noticed. The adults watched them constantly but spoke to them only to give orders or quote scripture. Most disturbing of all was the way Preacher Crow had looked at her, as if she were not a person at all but some kind of prize to be claimed when the time was right. Life in Bitter End followed a rigid schedule that left little time for rest or contemplation. The orphaned children rose before dawn to begin their chores, which included tending the settlement's small gardens, maintaining the wooden walkways that connected the buildings, and performing whatever labor the adult members of the congregation required. Breakfast was a thin porridge of cornmeal and whatever vegetables could be grown in the swamp's acidic soil, consumed in silence while Sister Abigail read passages from Scripture that emphasized obedience and the rewards awaiting those who submitted to godly authority. The morning hours were devoted to what Sister Abigail called education, though the lessons bore little resemblance to the schooling Alara and Silas had received before their parents' death. Instead of arithmetic or geography, they were required to memorize lengthy passages from the Bible, particularly those dealing with the punishment of the wicked and the special status of the chosen people. Any mistake in recitation resulted in swift correction, often delivered with a wooden switch that left welts on their hands and arms. Preacher Crow took special interest in Alara's religious instruction, calling her to private sessions in his study, where he explained the deeper mysteries of faith that were supposedly too complex for younger minds to grasp. During these meetings, he spoke often of marriage as a sacred institution designed to preserve the purity of the faithful bloodline. He touched her shoulders and arms while speaking, his hands lingering longer than necessary, his breathing growing heavier as he described the duties that awaited her as a woman of faith. The other orphaned children seemed to understand something that Alara and Silas were only beginning to grasp. They moved through their daily routines with the mechanical precision of people who had learned that the smallest deviation from expectation could bring terrible consequences. They spoke in whispers when the adults were not present, and even then only of the most mundane topics. Questions about the outside world, about their past lives or future prospects, were met with nervous glances and quick changes of subject. As the weeks passed, the siblings began to notice disturbing details about their new home that had escaped their attention during those first overwhelming days. The Crow family's physical resemblances were too pronounced to be mere coincidence. The congregation's children all bore similar features, suggesting relationships that went beyond the bounds of normal kinship. Most unsettling of all were the periodic disappearances that no one seemed willing to discuss, the empty beds that appeared without explanation, and the names that were quietly removed from the roster of souls under Preacher Crow's care. The arrival of officials from the outside world was rare enough in Bitter End to create a stir of nervous activity throughout the settlement. In the autumn of 1889, the county appointed a new inspector to oversee the welfare of indentured children in the rural districts. Unlike his predecessor, who had been content to accept written reports and rarely ventured beyond the more accessible communities, this man took his duties seriously enough to make the difficult journey through Blackwater Slough. James Morrison was a thin, methodical man in his 40s who had served as a clerk in various government offices before accepting the position of County Child Welfare Inspector. He arrived at Bitter End on a crisp October morning, his wagon loaded with ledger books and forms designed to document the condition and treatment of children under state protection. What he found during his 3-day visit troubled him in ways that his official reports could only hint at through careful bureaucratic language. The children he interviewed spoke in the flat, rehearsed tones of people who had been thoroughly coached on what to say and what to keep silent. They assured him that they were well-fed, properly housed, and receiving adequate religious and moral instruction. Their physical condition seemed acceptable, though he noted that they appeared unusually thin and pale, with dark circles under their eyes that suggested chronic fatigue or stress. More disturbing were his observations of the adult members of the congregation, particularly the Crow family itself. Preacher Crow's son Ezekiel moved with the slow, uncertain gait of someone whose mind had never fully developed, his one good eye-tracking movement with animal intensity, while his blind eye wept a constant stream of yellowish fluid. Sister Abigail's cough had worsened since his last visit, and she frequently excused herself from conversations to spit into her handkerchief, which she then quickly concealed. On his final day in the settlement, as Morrison prepared to depart, young Silas Whitfield approached his wagon while pretending to perform routine chores nearby. With movements so quick and subtle that they might have been accidental, the boy slipped a small piece of broken slate into one of the inspector's saddlebags. Morrison did not discover this message until he had traveled several miles through the swamp, when he stopped to rest his horse and reorganize his equipment. The words scratched into the slate, with what must have been a sharp stone or nail, were barely legible, but their meaning was unmistakable. The blood is sick. The message hidden in Morrison's saddlebag haunted him during his journey back to the county seat. As a government official, he was accustomed to dealing with complaints about harsh treatment or neglect of indentured children, but this seemed to suggest something far more sinister. The phrase, "the blood is sick," could refer to disease, but given what he had observed about the physical similarities among the settlement's residents, he suspected it might mean something even more disturbing. Morrison spent several days researching the history of Bitter End and the Crow family, digging through old records and speaking with anyone who had knowledge of the isolated community. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. The settlement had been founded by people fleeing the aftermath of the war, families who had intermarried for generations before retreating into the swamp to avoid outside interference. The pattern of taking in orphaned children was relatively recent, beginning only after signs of serious physical and mental deterioration had begun to appear among the adults. Armed with this information and the desperate message from young Silas, Morrison convinced the reluctant county sheriff to return to Bitter End with him for a more thorough investigation. Sheriff William Hayes was a practical man who understood the political difficulties involved in challenging a religious community, especially one led by a preacher with a reputation for piety. However, the implications of Morrison's discoveries were serious enough to warrant the risk of causing offense to powerful interests in the county. Their return to the settlement in late October was met with barely concealed hostility from the adult residents. Preacher Crow demanded to see warrants and questioned their authority to conduct searches without specific allegations of wrongdoing. When they insisted on interviewing the children separately, Sister Abigail hovered nearby, her presence a clear reminder of the consequences that awaited anyone who spoke out of turn. The investigation yielded nothing that could be used in court. The children, when questioned individually, repeated the same reassurances they had given during Morrison's previous visit. Their living quarters were sparse but adequate, their physical condition acceptable by the standards of the day. No evidence of abuse or neglect could be documented in terms that would satisfy a judge or jury. After 2 days of searching and questioning, the officials left empty-handed, promising to return with proper legal authority if any evidence of wrongdoing came to light. As Sheriff Hayes and Inspector Morrison rode away through the darkening swamp, neither man spoke of what they both knew to be true. They had failed to save children who desperately needed rescue, and their failure would soon have consequences that neither the law nor conscience could undo. In the weeks following the failed official investigation, Alara and Silas knew that their time was running out. The adults watched them more carefully now, and Preacher Crow's private sessions with Alara became more frequent and more disturbing. He spoke increasingly of her approaching womanhood and the sacred duties that awaited her as a vessel for continuing the Lord's work among the faithful. His touches became bolder, his breathing heavier, and his pale blue eyes held a hunger that had nothing to do with spiritual salvation. The breakthrough came when Silas discovered a loose floorboard in the church during one of his cleaning duties. Beneath it lay a small, leather-bound ledger that contained records the Crow family clearly never intended for outside eyes. Written in Preacher Crow's careful hand, the book documented the arrival and fate of every orphan child who had been brought to bitter end over the past decade. Each entry included the child's name, age at arrival, and a number that initially meant nothing to the siblings. Thomas Whitmore's entry showed the number 3, followed by a note about his departure to join the Lord's work in a higher realm. Other children who had supposedly run away or been placed with families elsewhere were listed with similar numbers and equally cryptic notations about their final disposition. The most chilling discovery came when Silas found their own entries near the end of the ledger. Next to his name was the number 5, while Ilara's showed the number 1 with a star beside it. As they studied the book more carefully, the meaning of the numbers became horrifyingly clear. They represented not years or months, but a countdown to some predetermined fate that awaited every child who entered the settlement. Hidden in the same cavity was another document that explained the true purpose behind the Crow family's charitable work. Written in the form of a letter that was apparently never sent, it detailed the physical and mental deterioration that generations of intermarriage had brought upon the bloodline. The solution, according to the writer, was to introduce fresh blood from outside sources, children who could be raised within the faith and eventually incorporated into the family structure through marriage and breeding. The letter spoke of the orphaned children as chosen lambs whose sacrifice would preserve the purity of the faithful for future generations. It described procedures for selecting the most suitable candidates and methods for ensuring their cooperation when the time came for them to fulfill their sacred purpose. The casual, businesslike tone of the document made it clear that the authors viewed the children not as human beings, but as livestock to be bred for the continuation of their twisted dynasty. As Ilara and Silas read these revelations, by flickering candlelight in the empty church, they understood that escape was no longer possible. The swamp that surrounded them was too vast and treacherous to navigate without help, and the adults who might guide them through it were the same ones who had planned their destruction. Their only choice now was between submitting to the fate that had been chosen for them or finding a way to ensure that no other children would ever suffer the same horror. The Sunday service of October 26, 1890, began like countless others in the history of Bitter End. The congregation gathered in their crude wooden church as the autumn sun sank toward the horizon, their voices raised in hymns that spoke of divine judgment and the cleansing power of righteous fire. Preacher Crow stood behind his pulpit with the commanding presence that had dominated this community for 3 decades. His sermon focused on the approaching end times when the faithful would be separated from the wicked through trials of flame. But on this particular evening, 2 members of his congregation listened to his words with knowledge that transformed their meaning entirely. Ilara and Silas Whitfield sat in their assigned places in the front pews, their faces showing none of the revelation that burned within their hearts. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering materials and planning their actions with the meticulous care of generals preparing for a decisive battle. As Preacher Crow's sermon reached its crescendo, describing the lake of fire that awaited those who rejected divine authority, Ilara suddenly doubled over in apparent distress. Sister Abigail hurried to her side, her yellowed handkerchief pressed against her mouth to muffle her persistent cough. The disruption provided the perfect cover for Silas to slip quietly from his seat and make his way toward the rear of the church, where the heavy wooden doors stood open to admit the cooling evening air. The plan they had devised was simple in its terrible efficiency. While the congregation's attention remained focused on Alara's feigned illness and the preacher's continued exhortations, Silas moved swiftly to secure the church's exits. The main doors were designed to be barred from the inside during times of trouble, but the iron brackets that held the securing beam could be manipulated to work in reverse. With movements practiced through weeks of secret rehearsal, he slipped the heavy wooden bar into place and secured it with a length of rope, effectively trapping everyone inside. The materials for what came next had been gathered over months of careful preparation. Lamp oil had been siphoned from the settlement's meager supply, one drop at a time, collected in small containers and hidden beneath loose floorboards throughout the building. Dry kindling had been smuggled in piece by piece and concealed in corners, where shadows would hide it from casual observation. Everything was positioned to create maximum destruction in minimum time, a conflagration that would consume not just the building but everyone trapped within its walls. When Alara's recovery from her supposed illness coincided with Silas's return to his seat, no one in the congregation suspected that their fate had already been sealed. Preacher Crow continued his sermon about divine fire, unaware that the flames he described so eloquently were about to become terrifyingly real. As his voice rose to its final crescendo, promising salvation for the faithful and damnation for the wicked, Silas struck a match and touched it to the nearest pile of oil-soaked kindling. The fire spread with supernatural speed, racing along trails of accelerant that had been laid throughout the building like fuses leading to a powder keg. Within moments, the crude wooden structure was engulfed in flames that turned the evening air orange and filled the swamp with the sound of screaming voices and splintering timber. The congregation's attempts to escape were met with doors that would not budge and windows too small to provide adequate exit routes for panic-stricken adults. Through it all, Alara and Silas stood calmly in the center of the inferno, their hands clasped together as they watched the flames consume those who had planned their destruction. The fire reflected in their eyes showed no trace of fear or regret, only the cold satisfaction of justice finally served. When the roof began to collapse around them, they walked together toward a section of wall that Silas had weakened during his months of preparation, stepping through it into the cool darkness of the swamp beyond. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want you to tell me what you think about what we've uncovered so far. Leave a comment below, and if you're finding these revelations as chilling as I am, subscribe so you don't miss the shocking discoveries still to come. The investigation that followed the Bitter End fire was hampered from the beginning by the remote location and the thoroughness of the destruction. When Sheriff Hayes finally reached the site 3 days after the blaze, accompanied by a county coroner and 2 volunteer firefighters, they found only a foundation of charred timbers and a scattering of bone fragments too small and numerous to allow for individual identification of the victims. The official inquiry, conducted according to the limited forensic methods available in 1890, initially supported the theory of accidental ignition. Rural church fires were common enough occurrences, usually caused by overturned lanterns or sparks from poorly maintained heating stoves. The fact that the doors had been found barred from the outside was noted but attributed to the congregation's practice of securing the building against potential intruders during evening services. However, closer examination of the evidence began to reveal inconsistencies that troubled the investigators. The fire had burned far hotter and spread far more quickly than would be expected from an accidental ignition, suggesting the presence of accelerants that had been deliberately placed throughout the building. The pattern of destruction indicated multiple points of origin, a characteristic typically associated with arson rather than accident. More puzzling was the discovery of what appeared to be prepared escape routes, sections of the church's walls that had been systematically weakened to provide emergency exits that bypassed the barred doors. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating these openings, work that required intimate knowledge of the building's construction and access to tools that would not normally be available to children. The breakthrough came when investigators expanded their inquiry to include Old Man Hemlock, the reclusive trapper whose property bordered the eastern edge of the settlement. Initially reluctant to speak with authorities, Hemlock eventually revealed information that transformed the entire understanding of what had occurred on that October night. Hemlock's sister Martha had been among the first orphan children brought to bitter end 15 years earlier. Like Thomas Whitmore and so many others, she had supposedly run away after growing restless under the strict religious discipline of the settlement. But Hemlock had never believed that story, and over the years, he had quietly gathered evidence that suggested a far more sinister fate for his sister and the other missing children. The trapper had been watching the settlement for months before the fire, documenting the comings and goings of its residents, and noting the patterns of behavior that marked the Crow family's treatment of their wards. When Silas Whitfield approached him in the weeks before the fire, seeking help with what the boy described as a plan to escape, Hemlock saw an opportunity for the justice that the legal system had failed to provide. The materials that made the fire so devastating had not been gathered by children working alone. Hemlock had supplied gunpowder, pitch, and other accelerants that ensured the complete destruction of the church and everyone trapped inside. His knowledge of the swamp's hidden channels had allowed him to guide the siblings to safety after their work was completed, leading them through waterways that would hide their trail from any pursuit. What had appeared to be a desperate act by trapped children was revealed as something far more calculated, a carefully planned execution carried out with the help of someone who had his own reasons for wanting the Crow family and their twisted congregation destroyed. The fire at Bitter End was not just an act of vengeance, but the final chapter in a conspiracy that had been years in the making. The revelation of Old Man Hemlock's involvement in the Bitter End fire created a crisis for county officials who had already committed themselves publicly to the theory of accidental tragedy. The idea that a respected trapper had conspired with orphaned children to commit mass murder was too sensational and politically dangerous to be acknowledged in official records, especially given the questions it would raise about the failures of the child welfare system. Sheriff Hayes, Inspector Morrison, and County Judge Aldrich Pemberton met in closed session to discuss how the investigation should proceed. All three men understood that a full disclosure of the facts would likely result in their own professional ruin, as it would expose years of negligent oversight and willful blindness to conditions that any competent official should have recognized as dangerous. The solution they crafted was elegantly simple in its dishonesty. Hemlock's testimony was sealed and filed in county records, with restrictions that would keep it from public view for 50 years. The old trapper was quietly relocated to a cabin in another part of the state, his cooperation purchased with a modest pension and a promise that his role in the affair would remain secret. The official verdict on the fire remained unchanged, a tragic accident that claimed 23 lives, including those of 2 missing orphan children whose bodies were presumably among the unidentifiable remains. The land where Bitter End had stood was sold for back taxes to a timber company that had no intention of developing such a remote and inaccessible location. Within 5 years, the swamp had reclaimed the cleared areas, and Spanish moss hung once again from cypress trees that grew through the foundations of buildings where families had once lived and died. The wooden markers in the small graveyard rotted away, leaving no trace of the names or dates they had once recorded. Inspector Morrison submitted his final report on the incident and immediately requested a transfer to another department, claiming that his health had been affected by the stress of the investigation. Sheriff Hayes served out his term but declined to run for re-election, spending his retirement years in the company of a whiskey bottle and memories that haunted his sleep. Judge Pemberton continued in his position for another decade, but colleagues noted that he had developed a nervous habit of shuffling papers whenever the conversation turned to matters involving orphaned children. The official silence surrounding Bitter End was so complete that within a generation, even local residents began to forget the exact location of the settlement. Stories about the fire were passed down as folklore rather than history. Tales of ghostly figures seen moving through the swamp and mysterious lights that sometimes flickered in the depths of the cypress groves. The truth of what had happened became just another local legend, no more credible than stories of buried pirate treasure or supernatural creatures that supposedly inhabited the darkest corners of Blackwater Slough. In the decades following the official closure of the Bitter End investigation, the story took on a life of its own in the folklore of Blackwater Slough. Hunters and fishermen who ventured into the deeper parts of the swamp occasionally reported sightings of two figures, a young woman and a boy, moving silently through the trees at dusk or dawn. These apparitions, according to the witnesses, appeared solid and real rather than ghostly, but they vanished whenever approached or called to. Local historians and amateur investigators periodically attempted to locate the exact site of the former settlement, using old county maps and compass readings from surviving official documents. Most of these expeditions ended in failure, as the channels and waterways of the swamp had shifted significantly in the intervening years, making navigation treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with current conditions. Those few who claimed to have found remnants of Bitter End described foundations overgrown with vegetation and partially submerged in standing water that reflected the sky like dark mirrors. The story gained renewed attention in the 1920s when a sociology professor from the State University published a paper examining the Bitter End fire as an example of the dangers posed by isolated religious communities operating beyond the reach of legal oversight. His research, based on sealed county records that he had been granted special permission to examine, provided the first academic analysis of what had actually occurred in that remote corner of Georgia 30 years earlier. The professor's conclusions were carefully worded to avoid sensational language, but they clearly identified the fire as a deliberate act carried out by victims who had discovered evidence of systematic abuse and exploitation. His work drew criticism from religious leaders who viewed it as an attack on faith-based communities, but it also inspired other researchers to examine similar cases of child welfare failures in rural America during the late 19th century. Modern true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators have occasionally mounted expeditions to Blackwater Slough, armed with metal detectors, cameras, and recording equipment in hopes of documenting evidence of the settlement's existence. Most return empty-handed, defeated by the swamp's maze-like geography and the thick vegetation that obscures anything older than a few seasons. A few claim to have captured images or sounds that suggest a continuing presence in the area, but such evidence is typically dismissed by skeptics as products of imagination or deliberate deception. The most persistent searchers are drawn by reports of a carving on a large cypress tree somewhere in the most inaccessible part of the swamp, a crude but unmistakable depiction of two figures holding hands as they walk away from a stylized representation of flames. Local guides who know the area best refuse to lead expeditions in search of this supposed artifact, claiming that some parts of Blackwater Slough are too dangerous for outsiders to explore safely. In the summer of 1912, 22 years after the Bitter End fire, A hunter named Samuel Garrett became lost in the deepest part of Blackwater Slough while tracking a wounded deer. After wandering for 3 days through channels that seemed to shift and change with each passing hour, he finally stumbled upon a massive cypress tree that stood on a small island barely large enough to support its enormous trunk and spreading roots. What captured Garrett's attention was not the tree's impressive size, but the markings carved into its bark at roughly eye level for an average adult. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating these images, using what must have been a sharp knife or chisel to cut through the tough outer bark and expose the lighter wood beneath. The central image showed 2 human figures, clearly a young woman and a smaller male, walking hand in hand away from what appeared to be a building engulfed in flames. Below this scene were carved 2 names in letters that had healed over but remained clearly legible: Alara and Silas. Beneath the names was a date that made Garrett's blood run cold as he realized its significance: October 1895. The carving had been made 5 years after the fire that supposedly claimed the lives of these same children, proof that they had not only survived their escape from the burning church, but had lived in the swamp long enough to return to this remote spot and leave their mark. Garrett's discovery provided the final piece of evidence needed to confirm what investigators had suspected but could never prove. Alara and Silas Whitfield had not perished in the fire they had set to destroy their captors. Instead, they had vanished into the vast wilderness of Blackwater Slough, sustained by knowledge passed down from Old Man Hemlock and perhaps by their own desperate ingenuity. For at least 5 years after their supposed deaths, they had survived in one of the most hostile environments imaginable, living as ghosts in a landscape that most people considered uninhabitable. The carving represented more than just proof of survival. It was a declaration of victory over those who had sought to use and destroy them. By creating this permanent record in a place where only the most determined searchers would ever find it, the siblings had ensured that their story would eventually be discovered and their triumph acknowledged. They had not merely escaped from bitter end, they had outlasted it, surviving in freedom while their oppressors had been reduced to ash and forgotten bones. Garrett photographed the carving before making his way out of the swamp, guided by landmarks he had memorized during his days of wandering. His account of the discovery was initially met with skepticism, but the photographic evidence proved compelling enough to attract attention from researchers and journalists who had followed the Bitter End story over the years. Several expeditions were organized to relocate the carved tree, but none succeeded in finding the exact spot where Garrett had made his discovery. The image he captured remains the only physical proof that Alara and Silas Whitfield lived beyond the night they chose fire as their instrument of justice. It stands as their final testament, a message carved in living wood that continues to grow and heal around their words, even as the decades pass. In that remote corner of Blackwater Slough, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds from ancient trees, their story has become part of the landscape itself, a secret known only to the swamp and those brave enough to seek it in the deepest shadows of forgotten places. Whatever became of them after 1895 remains a mystery that the swamp has kept for more than a century. But their carved declaration proves that sometimes, even in the darkest circumstances, the oppressed can find a way to write their own ending in letters that time itself cannot erase. If you've followed this story to its haunting conclusion, please subscribe for more investigations into the forgotten tragedies that history tried to bury. The past has many secrets still waiting to be uncovered, and some of them are more disturbing than anything we've seen here tonight.